Good evening to everyone wherever you are. We're gonna let people filter into the space. And so I'm so glad you're able to join us this morning for this conversation on ecosystem restoration. Really looking forward to spending this time with you, with our speakers, as we look at the intersections of values and culture and spirituality with ecosystem restoration. And so, as we wait a couple of minutes for the room to fill up, if you could please let us know who you are, where you're from, and maybe why you're here today. I'd be so curious to learn what brought you into this space today as we explore with our wonderful speakers. So I'll give a minute for people to get settled, and then we'll get underway. And thank you. So my name is Andrew Schwartz, and I work at the Center for Earth Ethics, which is based in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. And in recent years, the center has been engaging in conversations and dialogues with people around the world on ecosystem restoration. And we've done this work in support of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And one of the outcomes of our work is our recently released report, Roots for Change, which outlines findings from a series of high-level dialogues we conducted. It also lays out the 10 principles of values, culture, and spirituality, which are informed by the consultations and highlight a variety of strategies that we hope can help successfully engage communities and accelerate the adoption of restoration projects while honoring the people and species that are living in the places being restored. Must extend enormous thanks to Krinagor and Gopal Patel for all their work in bringing the report to fruition. And we're not here so much to talk about the report, but I do hope you read it. Restoration by definition is a return to something to its former original normal or unimpaired condition. It's the restitution of something taken away or lost. And there's so much loss right now as we look around at the world, at our ecosystems, the degradation. And what I learned from the consultations is that the process of ecosystem restoration isn't just about replanting trees or cleaning a river. It is that. It's also about rebuilding and reconfiguring our relationship to nature and to one another. What does it mean to not just see the earth as a system of services or resources? What are non-extractivist ways of being? Restoration, restitution. These are things that extend into ourselves and our systems and our ways of being, that of course include repairing the damage to the land and the water and the sky, as well as the damage to ourselves and our neighbors. It's about looking to our cultures and our traditions, and remember that there are fuller, more heartfelt ways of being, and that restoration can be done in many different ways with all sorts of people. And for that reason, I'm delighted to be joined by our speakers, each of whom in their own ways are engaging the past to encounter the problems of the present so that we can have a strong and restored future. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists as we get underway. There's Gopal Patel, who is a recent alumni of the Center for Earth Ethics, and he's the co-chair of the UN Decade Advisory Board. Thais Corral, co-founder of Women's Environment and Development Organization, and founder of Sinal Diwali, and the co-chair of the UN Decade Advisory Board. Ayadi Mishra, architect, co-chair of We Are Tomorrow, and as I learned yesterday, some very cool things that I know she's going to talk about further on. And finally, Tariq Al-Olaimy, co-founder and managing director of 3BL Associates. All of these lovely people are members of the UN Decade Advisory Board. And I'm just so thrilled to be here with you all today. And if I can begin with you, Gopal, because you were so instrumental in all this work, and I know through your work as the UN Decade co-chair, I want to ask why it's important to consider these values, culture, and spirituality as we approach ecosystem restoration.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's great to be with you again and great to be with my fellow members of the Decade Advisory Board. Very excited for this session. Why is this approach important? That's a good question. I think for me, um, my understanding and the way I look at it right now, and you touched upon it, Andrew, is that the world is very messy, and the world has always been messy. And values, culture, and spirituality, in many ways, help us make sense of the mess of the world that we live in. It gives us insights into the world in ways of thinking that maybe current development approaches may miss. And so, for example, speaking from my own Hindu background, recently I came across the Hindu understanding of forests. That in Hindu text, it says that there are three different kinds of forests. There's a forest where you live, there's a forest where you meditate, and there's a forest where everyone, including animals, are welcome to come and find shelter. And so, while this may be pretty obvious that you have different categories of forests for different kinds of activities, it's probably simple and obvious. It's an ancient insight into the nature of nature. And it reveals a nuanced understanding, I think, of the world and how previous generations understood their relationship with the natural world. And so I think for thousands of years, values, culture, spirituality, and by extension, religion and faith have shaped communities and helped people in communities navigate the world, to deal with the complexities of life, to engage with the messiness of the world, but also to speak to the brokenness and the hope that we all experience. And I think in our current moment, what this lens, this approach of values, culture, and spirituality does, it allows for a conversation that may not otherwise happen. Andrew, I'm thinking back when we developed this idea back in late 2021, and we started having these consultations, we found that how both grassroots activists and global decision makers were animated by this topic, and it allowed them to talk and understand things in new ways when previously they may not have been able to. And I think also it's not something new. I think that's also why it resonates with us. This is something as old as the sun. I'm reminded of one of my favorite authors, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived in the 1800s here in Boston, just not far from where I am in New York. And in his most famous essay called Nature, he calls out the problem and he calls out the solution as well. He says, the reason the world is in ruin is because people are disconnected from themselves, and the problem of restoring to the world original beauty is solved by the redemption of the soul. And so that's why I'm saying it's something new, but it's also something old as well. And so I think what this approach does, it really speaks to something that's probably the most dear to all of us individually and in communities, and it speaks to our hearts. It reaches places, this is going to sound cheesy, but it reaches places that technical and bureaucratic language and approaches probably have difficulty reaching. And that's, I think, why we find constantly that people resonate with this idea of talking about values, culture, and spirituality. And as we're talking about a decade of ecosystem restoration, we're offering this approach as not the solution, not the only solution, but definitely part of the solution in the broader toolbox of ecosystem restoration approaches. And so that's why I think it's such an important topic. And I'm so grateful to have worked with you and Karena and everyone else at the center to develop this approach. And I love seeing that it's now really taking hold in so many different restoration conversations.
Thank you, Gopal. No, I really appreciate it. And I think there's one of the things that I also found really resonant within the consultations that we did is there's always a different level of conversation, because when you to this open up the perspective to the sense of, what do you value the most? How does your culture inform you? What does your spiritual tradition have to say? I was always surprised by the sort of conversation that we would have, because it pulled something out of people. It helped them, as you said, see something different. And I think that is part of the challenge right now, is how do we even conceptualize, visualize, imagine difference, and that we can be living differently in the world and experiencing one another in nature differently. And so that, to me, is such an important question to just be posing and creating space for. And I know, if I can, Thais, move to you, that's something that you've done in your career, in your life, is creating these spaces and creating opportunities for this place-based work that engages people on a deep spiritual, personal, human level, whether that's in the work that you've done at Sinal de Valle or the work that you've done connecting and empowering women. And so I wonder for you, and as we were talking a little bit yesterday, I got this, you said something to me that really stood out. It's like, how do we unlock these hidden connections? I'm curious for you, what have you seen from the work that you've done that why it's so important to interweave the restoration and the equality and the people aspect of restoration? Oh, unmute. Oh, you've got to unmute, Thais.
Yeah. Hi. Such a pleasure to be with you and to be with Gopal, Tariq, Ayadi, and I knew that I just met yesterday, Andrew. And yes, I think that I resonate a lot with you and Gopal said. It has always been there, no? That strong connection because as most spiritual like lineages say, we are all one, no? So disconnected has been made through part of probably of our evolution, no? How we can evolve through feeling one and at the same time being responsible by who we are. We are as this manifestation of life, which is in nature, which is in the humans, which is in all these forms that are alive. But what I feel that restoration really offers us, no, is that and that connection you made with values and culture and spirituality is just this awareness. No, what has been is becoming so known as a concept. No, the awareness system. Systems-based change, awareness systems-based change. And it's about exactly that awareness that we are, as we transform ourselves, which most of religion and spirituality talk about, we transform also the outside. We express it in the way in the world. And I think I see today as the only way, because otherwise we always fall back in our pitfalls of all these divides and divisions that we have even in ourselves, no, which is mind and which is the body, which is intelligence. So I think it's an opportunity for us to really make the reconnection, but through the work as well. And this is what this was a longing for me as a feminist, when I founded I co-founded with many other pioneers like Mangari Maathai, Bella Abzug. We do the Women Environment and Development Organization. We wanted to bring to the Rio 92 conference, to the Earth Summit, which was the first and probably the most, the landmark, for all these different conferences in which participation of civil society was made so important. After that, in 1992 and in the 2 previous years, it was that women have a say in the change of civilization. And I think it was exactly in pointing these hidden connections, the connections between that everything matters, because somehow all the previous thought and science and the way we develop, we kind of maintained a lot of things outside, the externalities that you didn't consider in economy and anything, and all the religions lineages is about making again it whole. And I think all the movements, the true movements, is again they claim to that integration again, that visibility again, which was the purpose of the women's movement. And what I thought is that, and when I founded Sinal 17 years ago, and I was about 50, I said, where can I really bring something that I learned through my life with all my networks that is really going to be valuable for the next generation and for the continuity of my own transformation. And it was Sinal. And Sinal is a place about work, application, of regeneration, of restoration, of of relationships and of self-healing, no? Which I think is very important as part of all this process. We heal ourselves, we also heal our relationships and heal the planet, no? So I think it's those containers that I feel like these cells, no, these ecocentric cells are kind of the in my view, the temples of the 21st century, you know, where people go to reconnect again, as we did for so many years in the temples. No? So I think all that we have learned through centuries, through religions that brought values and this culture of the highest values, human values, are now more connected to the restoration of the planet. And that's what I think is so important, that all of us are tuned to be also practical, no? Because it's not about that it's going to happen by itself or the governments will do. We'll have to be part of it. And this is somehow the example of Sinaloa Valley, which is also the expression of so many years of activism, you know, on the women's movement, on the environment's movement, and also in the spiritual movement, because I myself am a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. So this all is together here, all this convergence of all these paths of life, you know, the inner and the outer development. So that's my contribution for now.
Wow, thank you so much. And I think I appreciate what you're saying around like there's this multifacetedness to it, right? With the transformation of self, the transformation of our systems, the transformation, and I think there's always this sense of someone else needs to do it. And I think that's one thing that, you know, you brought up, Thais, and Gopal, you as well, is where do we start in ourselves? Where do we start then in our communities? How do we understand our own ability to move and transform? Because these problems seem so big, and they are so big. And the people that need to move are many. And so for that, to find ways within ourselves to make this transformation, and then I find in the restoration work, just the being able to see change right in front of you is so motivating. And so, you know, Ayadi, if I can invite you into the conversation here, because I know of the work that you're doing, and, you know, as we were talking yesterday, learning a little bit more of how you've shifted in your own work, working, you know, with tech and development, but also as this architect. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, you shared in this some thoughts in this really beautiful video I watched around, you know, this idea that we begin and end in nature, and just this concept of circularity that you weave into the work that you do. And so I wonder if you can really speak around, you know, how do we understand this in this, both in the development that we need to see economically and within our communities, and how that corresponds with what we need to see within the natural world. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And again, for this space. To start off, again, a huge shout out to the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition that allowed for that video to be there. It was a storytelling project that we did before COP, and it honestly grew out of this climate anxiety and this kind of onus of changing and leading that change in the world that we see that led into those thoughts. And again, a sober reflection of the ideas that, okay, what do I as an individual do now? What do I see in my community? What do I see in myself? And what do I see outside? Because again, one thing that pushed us over the edge, at least for people like me who were there in cities during the COVID times, was this concrete jungle that we were forced to be in. And that sort of led to this idea of, I honestly need to do more for myself. And that's something that led to this change from architecture of cities to architecture of, again, how people live, the habitats, and then moving towards especially rural areas. So something that always comes to my mind is, again, it's honestly said in a lot of feminist and, again, gender fluid spaces, is that why don't we race to the bottom? Why are we constantly racing upwards and taking spaces when something that we again see in nature is this idea of holding space for each other? And this is something, again, that was catapulted by me being in the UN Decade Advisory Board, which I inevitably learn from each and every single person over here as well, is that the power of individuals and then bring it back to community. Because at that time, I did not, again, realize that what I was talking about was spirituality, was again belonging to a community. Because again, for young people living in this context, a geopolitical context, there has been a weird divide and also a muddling of these concepts. But in the end, you always realize that why do I feel a certain sense of peace? Why do I feel this nice sense of belonging? And that's where everything we do comes into picture. So it's again something that my professors here in Sitara and IIT Bombay talk about, with Professor Date and again Professor Gadgil. These two are the main figures that talk about this, is that every sort of technology and development needs to be appropriated to a context. And that context is not just living simpler, but it's living appropriately. For example, every technology needs to be a part of that community. It does not need to be necessarily a disruption, but it has to be in a scale that can be inhabituated by the people, for the people, and then they can take care of it on their own. And the kind of examples that we see are you can't really. So there's a community again in Andhra Pradesh that does ethnic fishing along with growing paddy in the same area. So this is something that is indigenous to the population. When you have these Western thoughts that are in our policies, for example, which completely exclude this idea, you sort of dismiss what generations and generations of farmers have been doing and which works for this space, which again talks about how they have already figured out how much they need to take from nature, how can they give back to it, and how can they live together in that synergy. I think this is what speaks to me the most. I think that's also the answer to your question about how do we integrate this everywhere is again that balance, which we call this appropriation of not just technology, but also the idea of development, which fits differently in every community.
Thank you. And I think there's, I mean, I was loving what you're saying there, this difference between, why aren't we racing to the top? Why are we always having this race to the bottom? And I wonder for you, like, have you found, especially as we think about this climate anxiety piece and looking at future, like, how have you found the, how do I want to word this? Because there's a couple things you brought up. One of this management of climate anxiety and this relationship to restoration, thinking like, all right, so here's where I am. How do I manage this? And then also this sense of spirituality that you were naming. Have you found, like, how have you seen this working in the movement to try to create a better future?
One of the most recent examples that comes to mind is again at COP, because that was the most chaotic place I've ever been in my life, was a group of women who were just sitting there with a ukulele, just what we call traditionally chilling in a space. And then that sort of grew into an idea of, hey, why don't we make a space and have a pavilion? And so in this COP, we had a women and gender pavilion, which was essentially without chairs. You had little stools, you had places to sit around, and anybody from every gender, every identity was sort of involved. And the only solution that we could think of, and the way we were so open and so happy together while sharing our discomforts, while sharing this constant nagging feeling of doing something, of being something, was honestly being in a community where we felt that, wow, I'm not alone. Everybody feels this way. What more could we do from here? And honestly, this is where the idea of spirituality and community comes together for me, that it is different for everyone. And the kind of binding factor I saw everywhere, we all saw everywhere, was this intersection of activism, advocating for our planet, trying to be in a space where we feel like we belong, and inevitably nature. And this was something we constantly came up in every conversation, that where do you feel like you want to go? Why is your favorite color green? Why do you always constantly look for these earthly palettes? Does it, I mean, the more you introspect, the more you realize that we are social beings and we find ourselves in nature. And it honestly, that's why keeps on coming back. So it's not just about realizing that these are the actions I could do, this is how I can make the world a better place, but it's also sort of a social view about which communities do I care about, and how does that add together to a society that makes the world a better place, that leads to change in climate change. And that's the gist of it.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. You know, as you reference COVID, which is something that somehow has fallen out of the popular narrative as though it's something that didn't really happen, yet it's had such a profound impact on all of us, you know, and dramatically reshaped the world as we know it. And, you know, and I think that's something that has this rippling effect that goes unnoticed. But then it also, you speak to this loneliness epidemic that existed before COVID, but it was exacerbated by COVID. And I think that's something also that as we look at anxiety, as we look at kind of the mountains that we want to move, for lack of a better term, on this climate and environmental fight, that loneliness then just perpetuates this feeling that we can't, because who am I? Who am I in this broad world? And so creating these spaces, creating these moments, creating community of people who feel the same way, and then realizing that no, together we can do something is such a powerful thing to know and to feel inside as a truth. And so I really thank you for raising that. And then Tariq, if I can invite you into the conversation here and any reflections you may have. And I think one thing is, you know, I was uh, learning more about you and the work that you do. You were speaking about this public planet partnership. And, you know, that to me really resonated. And I'm curious for you as you look at um, your own understanding of restoration, the lens that, you know, that humans must deal with destruction and reconstruction and ecosystem, and, you know, how we're being forced to adapt and change to climate, and then with one another and with our economies and our systems. And so, yeah, I'm just so curious for your thoughts in that regard.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and hello, dear friends, and deeply resonate with all that Gopal, Ayadi, Thais, you just shared. I'm calling in from Bahrain today, which is where I'm from. I'm one of 65 million people who live in a small island. And in this kind of conversation, from an islander perspective, my starting point is always the same, which is nature doesn't just need our protection. Nature requires our active collaboration. And when we restore ecosystems, we are also reclaiming our ability to collaborate as nature herself, and to then revive our relationship with the ecosystems, the islands, the places that we call home. And for me, that's the essence of public-private partnerships, because that's the essence of that return, Andrew, that you were speaking to at the very beginning. And from a economic perspective, it's interesting because, of course, our economies are not standalone constructs. They are not standalone constructs just inhabited by humans. They emerge from and are embedded within the living and breathing biosphere. You know, 100% of our economies are dependent on the rest of the natural world. And we are at a point of our human story in which human culture is evolving at an unprecedented rate, obviously due to technology. And within the lens of restoration, how restoration has evolved and how humans participated has also evolved rapidly. Indigenous communities have been participating, of course, in restoration for millennia, but doing it at the speed of a river or the pace of a mountain growing or moving at the speed of pollination. But now we're forced to restore in a world that is moving at the speed of data centers and silicon chips and tweets that are coming out on X. And this acceleration of culture is happening at a pace that, of course, exceeds deep time. That for the first time in our human history, for the first time in natural history, this acceleration of culture that goes at a speed beyond the vast timescales of geological and ecological processes. And kind of in other words, or more simplistic terms, our human culture is evolving much faster than the natural systems that sustain our planet that have been self-regulating. And this is what we need to do as we adapt. But as a result, our natural systems are needing to adapt and move at a space and respond at a pace that is never known in deep time in geological history and ecological processes. And this kind of concept of public-planet partnerships is this reframe as moving beyond, you know, restoration sometimes being seen as a public and private endeavor. It is an endeavor in which we are all shared together with the human in the more than human world. We should be actively partnering with nature and restoration. We should be forging collaborations with other species. We should be trying to form trade deals with microbial communities. That's probably the only WTO endeavor that really matters now. We should be forming consortiums with our forests and coalitions with our oceans. We do need to think in these lens of how the more than human world is the human world's most important partner and stakeholder in restoration. And to go back maybe to finish what something that Gopal said is that this space that you kind of held today is maybe sometimes the only space we can really speak to these nuances. The UN Decade on Restoration has incredible scientific principles for ecosystem restoration to guide the UN Decade, to guide our flagship projects, to guide the best-in-class restoration that exists in the world. It is the best of scientific literature, I think, that exists as a coalition on restoration. And sometimes that science is our attempt to translate the language of the rest of nature. That science is our attempt to understand, the mother tongue of the forests, of the rivers, the insects, the deserts. And why I find the center's new report so important is that I think for a real understanding of the true nature of that language, of that science, science needs spirituality. The more than human world, as I said, moves at that speed of pollination. It speaks in the language of deep time. It speaks in the language of inwardness, of silence, of the systemic sacred. And I think without a spiritual lens to restoration, it's very difficult actually for the scientific world, the policy world, those that are doing restoration work around the ground to rewater the seeds of a more liberated approach, not only just for humans and our economic systems, but also for nature.
Wow, thank you. Really, the systemic sacred. We could do an entire talk on that. I love that phrase. It's just brilliant, and just kind of. I think there's a lot to unpack, and it's inspired some questions that I'm seeing in the chat. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat or to the Q&A, because we're getting to that point in the conversation. I think a few things jumped out to me, and one is this exceeding deep time. And I think, Gopal, that's something you and I have talked about as well, of our traditions exist on a time scale that modernity just can't begin to touch. And I think about just how much change has happened in my life. And so there is, and Tariq, and really anyone of the panelists, if you want to respond to this question, is, as I formulated it, is this sense of how do we anchor ourselves in a time where so much is changing so fast. And I don't know if you all are feeling this too, but I find in my work that the scale and the speed and the frenetic energy that exists within the climate environmental space right now is overwhelming. And so I think there's also this question of, what are ways that we can anchor ourselves in this deeper sense of time, and then this deeper sense of also the now, so that we can slow down enough to reasonably encounter the speed of change that we're witnessing and experiencing in our own lives. I don't know, Gopal, if you had any thoughts there.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to other panelists for letting me try and answer that. Well, let me think. Well, I think something that it may not answer your question, it probably doesn't, but something that comes to mind is building on a little bit of what Tariq had mentioned around, our economic systems and models don't exist in isolation. I know you didn't use these exact words, but they don't exist in isolation. They exist because we as people created them, right? And so we have to take some responsibility for the systems that exist because they are a product of our collective thinking, whether we like it or not. And I think a lot of our current systems emerge from approaches of extraction, colonialism, oppression, and those, and we may have said we've got away with a world where that is prominent, but the systems still exist that were built on those models and systems. And so one thing I'm really trying to focus on, maybe it gets to your question, Andrew, around how do we keep pace with the change? I really feel like we have to, I really feel we're moving in a direction from, let's say, colonialism to more collaboration. And I really feel like the more we can find effective ways to collaborate, we don't all need to keep a pace with the change, because if we're connected and collaborating in the right ways built on trust, you know I don't have to keep track of everything that's going on, because I know Tariq is tracking that, and Ayadi is tracking this, and Thais is tracking that bit. And so the collective as a whole is tracking it, but it doesn't mean like every individual person has to be tracking it as well. And I think an example of that, of this collaboration, was just at this past COP28 in Dubai, where the head of the UNFCCC and the head of the UNCBD put out a joint statement around the importance of nature and climate, which I think was the first time something like that had happened, you know, because there'd been a lot of conversation about the isolating and the siloed approach to the climate COPs. And so I think the more we can move into a more collaborative approach, because the world is so interconnected today, I think we can get towards tracking and being abreast of the rapid change that you and Tariq had mentioned. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my very initial response.
It points at it, I think. And no, thank you. I mean, it's tough and it's hard. And Thais, I do wonder, because you've been in movements for so long and you've been doing this work and you've created these spaces. I wonder for you, you know, kind of in this looking back to look forward, whatever you've seen that has worked or is working that you wish you could see some more of or would like to see more of, so that we can, you know, get to where we want to go in terms of restoration, but also as these larger communities and societies that are, you know, desperate for change.
Well, I think certainly I agree with what Gopal said, the relational part, you know, the collective, but through relationships that are ecocentric and not egocentric. In my view, a lot of the networks that we see today, and I think they evolved. I mean, when I see, which I think that it was the most important, movement of the 20th century, which was the women's movement, it was all based in relationships. No, it was around kitchen tables, just women telling their own stories and making it very intimate as well. And so it didn't matter. It didn't matter from where you came from. No, if you were like, to some extent, of course, there were all these divisions that we see in society, these divides of class, of race, of culture, of religion. But to some extent, that was a common thread. No, and that common thread somehow was what pulled the movement to become bigger and larger. And I remember when I went in '95 to Beijing, to the women's conference in Beijing, which was the one that was really, in spite of the fact that that was when China was opening, there were really women from everywhere, from nuns, from women from the Central Asia, to all of them. So what brought them to go so far, to go to Beijing, is that trust that they will find something with whoever was there in common, no? And I think somehow what I miss today, that I think it was more present in the past, is that commonality. You know, what I see a lot in the movements today is to some extent this strong sense of identifying which is your identity and what is somehow different from there. And I think this somehow, I think it's always important, but I think it was created, it's something more common from our times, and it just, as you have been saying, the technology has accelerated it. We have many ways to express, everybody has a way to express themselves. And what I have been saying, and we don't talk to each other, we don't share the same space, and we don't share, we share the same space as we are sharing here through technology, but we don't share the same space, physical space with nature. That's why churches and temples have been so important in all spiritual traditions, because somehow we have to have a place in which we meet energetically, you know. And I believe that we have more time for that today. And today the technology has replaced, and after the pandemic, it is even stronger that we think that we are maximizing, we don't know our time because we can meet online, we don't use transportation, but also we miss the opportunity to open to the unknown, because when we meet somebody, and I feel it so much when I am talking to somebody physically, and I am giving all my attention, always there is something that emerges that was unexpected, so we have lost, I think we have to recall this possibility of mystery, and magic that we have somehow replaced with this velocity, this speed in which we think that we are pushing something, but we most of the times pushing for more of the same, and that's what I would say that to some extent in the past was different because we kind of meet more, really meet, there were more encounters than I think we are today, because everybody's so busy.
That's right. Absolutely. And I just love what you said with the possibility of mystery. I've got two young kids, and the world is full of possibilities. It's so mysterious. And I think that's something that I love because it takes me out of my, this is what I need to know, this is what I need to do. When all of a sudden you're on an adventure. And there's nothing like being on an adventure with a 3-year-old. It's very magical. And that just that, how do we continue cultivating that in ourselves, that childlike wonder and that childlike just appreciation of the world that's around. And granted, that's easier for some than others, and it's contextual, and we need to, all these things are true, but there's also this sense of possibility. And I wonder, Ayadi,
An openness, no? An openness.
yes, absolutely. There's openness. And I think that's what you were speaking about too, Ayadi, as you were talking about the COP process and just creating space, creating space. And so I wonder, and looking at one of the questions from the audience is this sense of how do we cultivate this regenerative culture and mindset? I wonder if, Ayadi, if you want to try tackling that, just given the work that you do, and especially now that you're in this development space.
Yeah. Thank you for throwing that hard question on me. If I were to take a gander on it, I'm honestly reminded of what Daniel Christian always says, that because we come from different traditions, because we come from different cultures, even the nature of that regenerative culture that we're looking for on an ecological, on a social, on a cultural context, it would manifest and it would show up differently. And that's where, again, this appropriateness, this cultural regional contextualism that we call again in architecture, that comes up into play, that it's not just about cities, it's not just about what we consciously want to build, but it's also about these very intrinsic questions about who are we, where are we going, what is the need to go, what is the need to build. I think that's what it also leads on to. And I think, again, like I'm always amazed and reminded of the kind of space we are here in this together when I hear people like Tariq, Gopal, and Thais speak again about, again, these ideas of these systemic spaces that people used to create for each other that we have seen manifesting now, and sort of relating to the kind of work that we do here, recognizing that, again, it's a different economic system too, because it's not that barter system that used to be, that community space that used to be, but we're moving to a digital economy. But again, over here, we see the exact same thing that used to be a belief, for example, a space that is networked, having co-production together without the morals and the ideas and the need of profit. That used to be something that communities intrinsically valued. And that's not what companies used to believe in. The largest, again, just to name a couple of giants, it would be Meta, Google, etc. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is not what they believe to be something that would be viable in this current economy. But this is not what we see now. We again see this idea of indigenous communities that working together, working for each other, working in this systemic welfare system, that creates even more profit, that creates even more wealth of knowledge, that creates this, again, idea of knowledge of the common of the anonymous and of this average human being, which we often do not tap into. And that's what's interesting to me, that, the things that we used to dismiss, that, hey, okay, there has to be dedicatedness, there has to be, again, restricted users, there has to be IPs, there has to be more protection around what you innovate, what you create. Again, bringing back this dimension of technology and development, you still see that open source, what we now call as open source softwares, open source platforms, etc., like they're creating even more wealth. And again, something that people are usually after, which is economy, and then again, belongingness, all of it in these old sacred systems of being. And I think that's also something that is really interesting to me, and which also adds to this dimension of we are probably also going back when we go forward, and we've seen that as something that is still relevant. And I think that also brings back the dimension of what we've been talking about, of reconnection. I think that's quite interesting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so I wonder then, Tariq, if I can, on this, because you talk about this people planet partnership, and Ayadi just kind of as talking about the putting profit on everything. There's a dollar sign on everything. It's hard to escape in this neoliberal world that we live in, any sensibility beyond profit. And I'm not sure when greed became a good thing. It was probably in the 80s. But like there is that kind of that sensibility of, this what's best is what makes me the most, regardless of the externalities, the hurt, the harm that is being covered through the world. And so I want to pay attention to this question that came through the chat, Tariq, that was on this question of, understanding our own spiritual dispositions towards the monetization of nature. And even, I don't know if this is, you want to go too deep into the carbon market and credits and tokens, but the sense of, how, because this is the lingua franca, the money is the thing that people are choosing to move, and monetization of nature is apparently the carrot for promoting action. I wonder, yeah, how do we understand that within our own value systems and our own needing to reframe our relationship to nature?
It's a beautiful, beautiful question, and I think such an important one for this conversation. I mean, I'm just kind of noting as well, whether it comes to credits or tokens or currencies, I mean, these are tools, and I think whether they're compatible in our value systems, the line with restoration, I think I'll simplify it. I think it depends on, is it extractive or non-extractive? Our current systems, the neoliberal systems we have today, are largely extractive, and we have data points that tell us and suggest why and how they are. Our current systems are financially extractive because majority of wealth is concentrated in the 1%. We know it's materially extractive because we have now crossed 6 of Earth system and planetary boundaries. We also know it's extractive in nature, particularly because when it comes to water loss, biodiversity loss, wildlife loss, species loss, and a scale that we cannot even fathom. We also know it's socially extractive because we still see that modern day slavery exists. We still see that there's human rights violations across business. And I think there's no viable method for ecosystem restoration without a value system that is non-extractive, without decarbonization of our economy, without building fair markets, without having fair economies in societies, actually without the degrowth of our material economy, and without the investment in human development. And I think those models and modes, there is a place, I think, for them within a non-extractive framework. And I point to the degrowth movements, the post-growth movements, the beyond GDP movements, the well-being economy movements. They're at the forefront of really thinking that when we take a non-extractive lens, a well-being centered approach for humans in the more than human world, actually start to think about social innovation in a very different way. I'll maybe put a plug here of, if you search post-growth social innovation, which is our library that we've put together exactly around this question of thinking about what does it look like to have these innovative approaches in a lens, in a frame that is centering a non-extractive economy. So I think it's yes, they can coexist as long as it is meeting the principles of what all spiritual traditions really seek for, which is do no harm and really make sure that we have a world that is fair and that is equal and that works for all in these very specific economic ways.
Thank you. It's beautifully said. And I think it is this, as much as we need to build up this inner transformation and this, this sense of restoration and reworking, there's also, as you say, the degrowth, the phasing out of fossil fuels. So many of the things that we can aspire to only can happen if, we remove the things from our systems and our societies that we know are killing us, and that we can pull back then from these planetary boundaries, as you mentioned, that are alarming, to say the very least. And so, friends, we're coming close to the end of our time. So I want to invite the speakers, if you will, if there's a call to action or a final thought you have, something that you've reflected or heard in this conversation that you want to bring out for maybe a minute, because I know time is short and I want to respect everyone's days. But Gopal, if I can start with you, any thought, call to action, moment to lead us off on?
Can you not go in the reverse order? You're always asking me to go first. I'm like struggling. I think my reflection, call to action is please download this guide that we put together, Roots for Change, by using values, culture, and spirituality.
Just put it in the chat.
Ecosystems. You put it in the chat. That's my call to action. I mean, it wasn't just Andrew, the two of us, and Karina who put that together. That was, the result of speaking with dozens of people across the world over a 12-month process, and it's really reflective of so many things that we've been talking about today. And so I'd really encourage everyone to download that and see how it can be used in all of your efforts, not just in restoration work, but across all environmental advocacy and campaign and activism work. I think it can span a number of sectors. So please download that.
Thank you, Gopal. Thais, any words from you?
Yes, I think it's for me what I would maybe bring here is how is a tip, how to maintain hope, in a time in which things can change from day to night, and they can even be dismantled in very. You can maybe be working on something that you feel in which you have put a lot of your love and expression of your values, and it can be dismantled very quickly. So to kind of go back internally to really what is hope and how to cultivate hope in spite of anything. So I think in that sense, the spiritual guidance, in most cases, those tips, those tools that you have, inner tools of supporting, like the good action in spite of all the difficulties. I think it's very important. And hope, after all, is something that has to make sense. Is to do something that makes sense to you, in spite of what happens in the world. So that's maybe my last reflection, because it was what I somehow keep for me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And to you, Ayadi.
I think I have personally so many notes from this call, and I'm just reminded that I'm standing on the shoulder of these giants. My one major reflection would be that, again, that there is no one-stop solution and the same answer to anything that we do, whether it be ecosystem restoration or, again, as small as something that applies, for example, in my master's thesis or in your day-to-day lives, very, very small actions. But that also it majorly stands on this idea of a fair and just human society that is not just fair and just for us humans, but also to the more than human world, as Tariq said, and that it is not as much away from each other as we think of, that usually even the way we work, the way governments work, every system we see is in silos, but that is not how nature works. And I feel that in every way, there is so much to learn from the world that we live in. and that one narrow lens, one individual is not enough to do it. So I think my major reflection is this, that there can be so much more building together that can happen in these three domains. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Tariq, to you.
I will bookend Gopal's comment and say that once you've downloaded and read the report, have a conversation with your team about it. At the end of the day, the path to wisdom is to awaken conscious action. And in particular, I think Principle 9 is around developing inner restoration. And that is a practice that we can never do alone. We are, as we've seen in this conversation, a tangled and beautiful web together. And I really hope you can read those principles and have a conversation with your team, your colleagues, your classmates, those that are maybe your neighbor, and looking at what does this actually mean in our lives, in our work, and how can we at least bring one of these principles a bit more consciously into action in our day-to-day over the next few months. And I trust that when we're able to do that on the deepest level of what the words that are written mean, that is, I think, the place in which really brings the ground for most effective restoration that we can see.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you to you all, and thank you for the plugs for the handbook. It's something that we've worked very hard on, and I'm so glad that I hope that it has some impact, and I hope that for those of you here, and thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day, and for our wonderful speakers, thank you so much for your gift of your time and in knowledge and your wisdom. I've just so appreciated the conversation, and I look forward to how we can follow up in our own ways. And as you mentioned earlier, Gopal, just knowing that you're out there doing the work, and for all of you who are here, that you are all doing your work, and that gives me hope, that gives me courage, that gives me what I need to continue doing what I am doing. And for that, I'm deeply thankful. So from all of us at the Center for Earth Ethics, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, no matter how long or short that might be. I know many of you might be going to sleep soon. So thank you. And I'll follow up as I'm able after the webinar has closed. So thank you again. Thank you to our speakers, and I hope you all have wonderful days. So long. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.